Jeff Williams is a veteran application security expert who founded and led OWASP, Aspect Security, and Contrast Security. Jeff also created several highly successful open source projects, including JBomb, JOT, OWASP Top 10, WebGoat, ESAPI, ASVS, and more. Jeff serves as an advisor to NIST, CISA, PCI Council, Oasis Seraph, OWASP CycloneDX, OWASP Foundation, Eclipse Foundation, and advises many companies and agencies on AppSec. Jeff has a BA from Virginia, an MA from George Mason, and a JD from Georgetown. He's also a two-time Masters Basketball National Champion who would love to connect with you on LinkedIn. The focus of this interview is ADR, or Application Detection and Response. But we go in a lot of different directions, including security assurance, basketball, life, and a healthy dose of AppSec.
The Application Security Podcast is brought to you by Security Journey. We help enterprises reduce vulnerabilities through application security education for developers and everyone in the SDLC. Learn more at securityjourney.com.
Hey folks, welcome to another episode of the Application Security Podcast. This is Chris Romeo. I am the CEO of Davici, and I am joined by my good friend, Robert Hurlbut. Hey, Robert.
Hey, Chris. Yeah, Robert Hurlbut, and threat modeling lead as well as principal application security architect at Acquia. And always a great time to be here and talk about application security.
I mean, what's to talk about? I thought we've already covered everything. No, of course we haven't, because we have Jeff Williams with us, who is making his third appearance on the Application Security Podcast. Previous episodes, he gave us a history of OWASP, which I found fascinating because it was some things I didn't know about the early days of OWASP that Jeff taught us in that conversation. And then most recently, back in 2023, we talked about the tech of runtime security, which was also a good deep dive into how those things work. And one of the things I really appreciate about Jeff is he works for a company and started companies that provide technology in these spaces, but he's always open to talk about them generically and generally and help us understand how they work. And so Jeff is a true educator in our space, in that you can talk about this stuff and talk about concepts. And I always appreciate that about you. So first question, since we've already heard your security origin story before, what do you like to do that takes you away from computers and technology?
Oh, great question. So I was a competitive athlete in college, and so I try to stay pretty active. And if you meet me, you'll know why I play basketball. So about 8 years ago or so, a buddy of mine saw that there's these Masters basketball tournaments, and we picked one in Florida. And he was just like, let's just go. And we'll be free agents. We'll get picked up by some team, and we'll just go play and see how it goes. And it was super fun. We met a bunch of great guys, and we did terrible. We got smacked. The guys that we joined up with were really not there to win. They were there to drink a lot. They were staying out till 3 a.m. and by the last game, like, they couldn't really even run up and down the court. But it was super fun. One of them was a guy my size. They call him Clean. He's got the word clean tattooed down his arm. And he used to play with a Globetrotters like team. Just hilarious bunch of guys. But I started playing in these tournaments, and I realized, like, this gives a purpose to being in shape. Like, I used to compete a lot, and there was always a reason to stay in great shape, but I kind of lost that. I'm in my 50s, let's just say that for now. And so, like, having a reason has really helped. So I started building a team, and I started going to different tournaments, then put together a pretty good team, and we won the national championship for 50 and over basketball. And then the next year we won it again. And so now it's been 8 years. I've played in tournaments in Vegas and Utah and Chicago and Detroit and where else? I don't know, Florida a bunch of times. Detroit was interesting. The tournament was held on 8 Mile. But, like, I just think it's such a different world because, as I was saying before the show, like, everybody in who I know in tech knows that I play basketball because I post about it on LinkedIn and stuff, and they know. But nobody that I play basketball with has any idea what I do. And so they don't ask about it. They don't talk about cross-site scripting and stuff like that. So it's a nice escape.
So how does the competitive fire work when you're in a masters basketball tournament? Is there still some people that want to mix it up and and get super fired up, or is it pretty chill and that people are like, hey, we're all pretty old, and if we do something stupid, someone's going to be in traction for 2 years?
Oh no, it's like the guys that keep playing into their 50s and 60s. And by the way, these tournaments have like a 75 and over bracket.
Oh, wow.
And, but the people that are attracted to doing that are the ones who are hyper competitive like me.
Okay.
And so they go, and it is on. Like I've gotten in a bunch of scraps, like nothing where I got kicked out of any games or anything, but like it's super competitive.
Okay. Yeah, cool. Yeah, that's something that I've been, having played hockey for a long time in my life. Like I kind of reached a point where I just wanted to play. And so I don't play anymore right now because I haven't, there is not a league in North Carolina of people who are my age, also in the 50 and older bracket, but want to play competitively, but will all realize, hey, we got to go to work tomorrow. So,
Right.
because sometimes in hockey, you have more opportunities to do stupid stuff than you even do in basketball, right?
Oh yeah.
Because you've got a set of boards and around it, and you're used to smashing people into it as a part of the game. But I just haven't been able to find an environment, a group of people who are like, let's have fun, let's play hard, but let's leave all the stupid stuff that we would have done in our 20s, which would have resulted in a fight on the ice. That's just not allowed. So that's what I'm searching for, but I think it's cool.
There's this thing in Utah called the Huntsman World Games, and it's a whole Olympics for masters level competitors. And so
Okay.
when I went there were like 33,000 people went to this town in Utah, and they had a whole Olympics there, and it was really fun. Really
Yeah,
good time. Yep.
that's cool. No, I like that. I
Really
think
recommend.
the big takeaway there is find a reason to stay in shape, because
Yeah,
it'll make it a
now I
lot
think
easier.
about it. I'm like, I'm training for the next national championship. So like it it affects me.
Yeah, no, that's really cool. Thanks for sharing that story. It's important for people to see that there is more to life than security and what we do at conferences and stuff. Like there are things that are just so much more important.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Jeff, just to get started here, there's a story about threat modeling and pen testing without production security observability. I wonder if you could talk to us about
Yeah.
that and that situation.
So I spent many, many years doing threat modeling and pen testing on enterprise applications. And the first part of every engagement, I ran a consulting company, so we tried to standardize our practices. So I've focused on like the process of doing these things. How do we optimize it so that we can be more efficient, deliver more value for with less effort, and I really tried to think about how to do these things efficiently. But every effort, you start out with a new application and you got no idea how it works, right? So they engage you, and then you've got to learn like, okay, well, what framework is it built on? How does it do authentication? How does it do access to, how do routes basically just work? Like what databases do it talk to? There's like all this information about how the application works that you need to understand before you can start doing a threat model, before you can start doing a pen test. And so at Contrast, we've been trying to figure out how do we automate that? And ADR, it's kind of a side effect of runtime security, IaaS, RASP, ADR, is that we observe the application as it's running. And, shame on us for not thinking of this earlier, but we realized like, hey, we could also just generate a security blueprint that shows how this application works and where are all the security controls and where are all the dangerous functions that are used, where are all the backend connections, all that stuff that you need to know. We could all the endpoints, the attack surface, like you can automatically detect all that stuff. And if you take that blueprint and give it to the pen tester or the threat modeler, then they can start their work, the value add work. And I know you guys have done a lot of threat modeling. A lot of the information that goes into a threat model comes from sources like interviews and old Visio diagrams that nobody updated and questionnaires that people filled out. And so it's not like the most reliable source of data. And so then you get into the threat modeling exercise and you start digging around and asking more questions and you learn more stuff. And it's like very evolutionary. But I think we can radically accelerate that process by starting with a blueprint that was directly recorded from the running application. So it's real, it's truth. And I'll give you an example. Imagine you're talking about expression language injection. Okay. Well, if you're pen testing, you got to go through every route and test every header, every cookie, every URL parameter, every form parameter, every piece of the XML payload, every JSON attribute, and see if you can find something that accepts, $ brace or pound brace or whatever, and thinks that it's an expression. Takes forever. But if you have the blueprint, you can filter it. You can say, hey, just show me the routes that actually evaluate expressions. And then when you can go to those routes, you can choose the parameter, you can test it, and you're done. So you can easily imagine shaving off 50, 75, 80% of the work of pen testing if you can focus your tests on where they might actually work. And it's the same thing for SQL injection and cross-site scripting and all the other categories. The blueprint can also reveal some things that aren't typically tested, like access control and authentication. So you could filter the list and say, hey, just show me the routes where there's no access control check or no authentication check or some bad combination of hooks. Again, I don't know if they're right or not. It's not like vulnerability detection. It's not something you get from AST tools, but it's an architectural level analysis. And instead of having to test every single route to see if it's doing the right access control checks, which is hard. I mean, I've spent days doing this. This is kind of my specialty when I was doing pen testing. It's like testing access control because nobody does it. But if I could just dump it out and say, here's the access control matrix, here's all the checks that are done on each route, I could say, oh, here's these 3 routes don't have an access control check, or the role that they're checking for is wrong, like it's guest instead of admin. And you can look down the list and go like, oh, well, that's what I expected. Awesome, you pass. So that's what, security blueprints, security observability is all about to me, is like providing that context so that you can do all the other things in AppSec much more cost effective.
So has your thinking or your approach changed over the decades of time you spent in AppSec, like to embracing more of a secure by design approach? Or would you say that's what we were doing in the late 90s and we just didn't know, we didn't call it that? Or like how do you wrestle with that based on your multi-decades of experience?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, I think security by design is always what I've considered actual security. I'm like an assurance guy. I would say that none of what anybody does in security matters at all unless it's contributing to an assurance argument. So that's like my rule is like, does this help me communicate to somebody else that this thing is secure? And that means claims and evidence and like the whole assurance argument piece. And I actually think most of the things we do in security don't contribute very much. Because what does a vulnerability scan really tell you? If you get a list of vulnerabilities, how much does that really tell you about, how much does that contribute to your assurance argument? Like, does it really prove anything? So like the world has tipped since the late 90s towards a very much risk management approach to security. It's like, hey, let's try and make sure we don't do any bad things. And if we try to test for a bunch of the bad things, we find a few and fix them, then we're good. That is not assurance. That's not what I think of as secure by design. Secure by design to me is positive approach to that. It's like, let's say how we're going to build something with putting the right controls in place to counter the threats that we expect for that thing. And then let's provide some evidence that those things actually work, that those controls are effective. And if you do that, that's the core of your assurance argument. It's just people talk about wanting secure by design and assurance and even threat modeling to a certain extent, but those are really practices that are in orbit around a different planet assurance. We're stuck in a very tight, low planet orbit around planet risk. And achieving escape velocity to get into orbit around planet assurance is not going to happen unless there's intervention in the market. We've talked about this before, that the market for security is broken. So, unfortunately, we're stuck in a risk planet, and you got to play that game.
Yeah. So I'm curious now, the comment you made about vulnerability scans and the fact that they don't provide much on the assurance scale today. When we were doing Nessus scans back in the early 2000s, do you feel like that was contributing to the assurance argument greater because we knew less and we didn't have as much viewpoint of the world? Or like, how do you wrestle with that now historically?
No, not really. I mean, so look, that's negative evidence. If you find something that says, hey, you've got a vulnerability, that's a piece of negative evidence and you can fix the vulnerability and counter it. But it doesn't tell you anything about whether you're doing it right. So positive evidence works differently. Like if I said, I checked every route that's possible in this application and verified that there's an access control check on each one that has the right role associated with it, and it's tamper-proof and non-bypassable. Like now I've got an assurance argument and evidence to support that argument that I can create a positive assertion about that app. And we just don't have that. Like doing scanning for vulnerabilities never gives you that. All you can try to show is the absence of vulnerabilities, which is kind of impossible. There's always could be another vulnerability in something
that your scanner
so it's only interesting to me if we're actually proving that the defenses are complete and effective. And that's not what scanning does today.
Okay. So now to completely overturn the apple cart here, does AI make that assurance, that need for assurance that I knew I was going to get a chuckle out of you, but for real, is there hope that we can use generative AI in some way to do more of those because like having a human being go through that access control example you said where you're checking every endpoint, it's very expensive. And it seems like it's something maybe that AI could get to the point where it can go through, but I'm curious about like, how would you see AI impacting assurance?
Someone I was reading online described AI as a school bus full of interns. And by that, they meant it scales really well, does lots of work, but you can't really use it for something that you have to trust. And so I think that's great. There's a lot of security work that can be done by interns. Like you can set up the problem in a way that you could make AI do it. But for the hard stuff, like, actually analyzing code and coming to conclusions, like you can't really trust AI to do that. It's not so like, I think you got to be careful about AppSec because some things are really hard, like data flow analysis and things like that. Some things are pretty easy. Like if you wanted to verify clickjacking, for instance, you could potentially get AI to do that. Like, hey, hit all the endpoints on this app. If every one of them has an X-frame options header with the right setup, then you're defended against clickjacking. That's a positive argument. That's actually generating assurance. But AI is not going to be able to verify some aspects of AppSec. Like, is this encryption implemented properly? Probably not something you want to trust to the AI. But if you can simplify the problem, and the whole reason why I started the ESAPI project was to simplify the problem. If you could say, hey, let's make a bunch of strong controls. And then the problem is just verify that you use those controls in all the right places and use them correctly. That's something AI can do, but it can't actually verify the controls themselves because they're complicated.
Yeah, that's a good, yeah.
So I don't know. I'm not, I think AI is going to play a role, but actually it feels a little bit like blockchain to me right now. It's like solution searching for problems that it can be effective at.
Yeah. And it seems like the hype cycle seems to be on a downward. It seems to be on the downward trend now, though, of people aren't so gung ho that it's the answer to everything. I'm not seeing that as much as we did in the early days where AI is going to solve that for us.
Yeah. Yeah. We'll see. I mean, I do think that there are probably some use cases where it's going to end up being transformative, but it's not going to be for everything.
Yeah. I've drawn the same conclusion as well. And for a lot of the same reasons. So we're supposed to be talking about ADR,
Yeah.
but we had to talk about some other things too and have a little bit of fun there. As I told you before we started recording, I can legitimately say I have looked at ADR almost with no time invested. So this is going to be fun just to get a perspective on it because it hasn't come across my desk at this point. So, so let's define, because I'm sure there's other folks like me that haven't dove into it yet. Can you just lay a foundation for what is this ADR thing?
Yeah. So it stands for application detection and response. And so immediately you should think ADR is application security and API security in production. So not really anything to do with pre-prod. It's not about testing or finding vulnerabilities or libraries or SBOMs or any of that, all the stuff that we think of as AppSec. It's really on the other side. And the only thing we've had on the other side of that fence for a long time is WAF. ADR is an evolution of protection, application protection, and API protection in production. And so if you look at the history of operations side defenses in all the other areas of security, what you'll see is moves from perimeter protection to agent-based inside out kinds of protection. So like we had network firewalls, now we've got NDR, we had OS hardening, now we've got EDR to work on the operating system. So we got cloud protections has moved into CDR. And so like you kind of see this evolution towards agent-based solutions that run as part of that layer of technology. And ADR is simply filling that gap at the application layer. So I've talked with hundreds of companies about how they use their WAF, and let's just say it's not really effective. Like a lot of them have it disabled. A lot of them use a cloud WAF that has a default set of rules that they're not really tuning or tailoring or anything. And this is probably the most interesting thing is that the telemetry from the WAF, they say they're running it in log mode. Well, where do the logs go? Well, do they feed it into their SIM? Maybe. Do they use it at all? No, because the signal noise ratio is so high. And it makes sense because you've seen HTTP traffic for modern applications. It's really complicated. And so WAFs can't tell whether something's an attack or not by just looking at the HTTP. But ADR works from inside the running application. This is runtime security technology. And as you watch an application actually use the data from an HTTP request, from inside a JSON payload or inside an XML payload or HTML HTTP parameters and so on, you can see how that data is actually used by the application. And so you can be much more specific about whether something's a real attack and intervene in real time to block that attack. And so it's just, AppSec gets a lot easier if you're in the right place to observe what's going on. So I'll give you a SQL injection example. So a WAF sees, a single tick and or and a dash or something in an HTTP request, and it has to stop that request. It has to block it, right? Breaks applications. If it doesn't block it, then it's probably under blocking, and people can sneak through. So there's no way to fix that. But ADR, from inside the running application, it sees the data flow through the application end up in the SQL query and modify the meaning of that query. And when it observes that, it's like, oh, well, that's SQL injection, because that's the definition of SQL injection. Like, untrusted data modified the meaning of the query. It added an extra expression clause or whatever. So that's how ADR sees these vulnerabilities. So it intervenes only when it sees an actual attack, like something actually getting exploited. Then it says, hey, whoa, let's stop that and keep the application safe. So that's really the difference. And that's why there's another sort of DR in the XDR universe. Like, this is just another source of events that feed into the SIM or the XDR environment or their CNAP or whatever. And it just feeds into the operations analysts, the security analysts' current tools. So it's not like a separate dashboard or anything. It's just new data.
Have they standardized the reporting that comes out of all these DRs in such a way that it's not like the old days where nothing really ever talked to anything else, even though that was always the single pane of glass, which nobody ever achieved? So there's a standard way, so it's not custom for everything?
Yeah, generally there's a model called CIM, that has got all the sort of attributes that you'd want. And then, ADR has some things that it can report that other layers of detection, and that's supported. So you can just feed all that into Splunk or whatever and view it that way.
You mentioned about runtime security and just curious about ADR and relationship or differences to IAST and RASP.
Yeah. So all of those are runtime security technologies. IAST works pre-production. It just sits in the background and detects vulnerabilities as you do your normal development job. We've talked about that. RASP was sort of the first iteration of this in runtime and in production. And so really RASP was designed to sell to AppSec teams. And that's a little weird, right? Because you're trying to sell an operations technology to AppSec, and then AppSec has to go to the operations teams and plead with them and say, hey, please put this on those production servers. And they're like, oh, hell no, we're not doing that. And it's just a little kind of a square peg, round hole thing. And so RASP was always designed for AppSec and really kind of development, actually, which is a little weird. So ADR is a evolution of RASP technology. And there's a number of different vendors that are now in the ADR space. And here it's the same kind of analysis happens at runtime. Some of those products use kernel level instrumentations to try to watch what's going on at the app level. Others, like Contrast, we actually monitor the application layer directly. But regardless of how it works, the evolution here is that it's feeding data directly to operations teams. It's sold to operations teams. It uses the language of operations. So it's much more about events and incidents and runbooks than it is about vulnerabilities and tickets and trace. So it's different buying centers, I think, is a lot of the evolution of this market. And then there's other innovations like the security blueprints that I talked about are a part of ADR that wasn't really part of RASP. So it's a little more context, because actually the operations folks don't have a lot of insight into applications and what they're doing and APIs and what they're doing. They're kind of blind to it. And so their first reaction, if there's some problem with the app workload, is go find the development team. But we're trying to give them much more information so that they can understand those attacks and deal with incidents themselves in a lot of cases.
So you're describing a world where the what I would think of as the pre-DevOps era, where we had development kind of on one side and operations.
Yeah.
And so are you seeing that the reality of kind of the modern enterprise environment is that there is the kind of the silos are creeping back, or they never went away, or what's What's kind of your perception of that? Because I haven't heard people talk about operations as a separate function much. Like I said, I haven't looked at ADR, dove into this at all. So, but I haven't, it felt like we were kind of moving on a trajectory of we're all working together. But now I'm wondering, is that really not the reality for what's happening in real companies?
We've made progress towards DevOps. I'd say in security, we've made more progress towards DevSec than we have to SecOps, at least at the application layer for sure. I feel like DevOps is more of a reality at the infrastructure level, where development teams are, they're building containers, their build pipeline cranks out a container, it automatically goes into production and gets running and so on. But at the application layer, there's still a pretty significant divide. And it's because application security technologies, in production, there isn't really anything. There's just the WAF, and it's, they're kind of been marginalized. That's a 25-year-old technology, 23-year-old technology, something like that. And it's still, just a lot of regexes at the network perimeter. So it's just, there's just not a lot there. And so I'm hopeful that ADR will help to bring that vision of DevSecOps even further down the road.
When we think about the now classic technologies in a company's AppSec stack, so the SASTs and the other one, four-letter word, I don't say, but SAST and SCA and things like that that are typically at the developer workstation level, they're in the pipeline. Does ADR replace some of the need that I have for that? Do I still need to have a full cycle approach? Like, how do these things work together, or do they work together?
Yeah, it's a fair question. I mean, you might ask the question like, hey, if I've got protection in production, why do I need to fix these vulnerabilities at all? Like, why am I even looking for them? And I think that's a little reckless. Uh, I think there's really good need for ADR in production because I talk with hundreds of companies about their AppSec programs, and across the board, the size of the vulnerability backlogs for apps and APIs is staggering. Ponymon did a study recently where they found 1.1 million vulnerabilities is the average enterprise AppSec backlog. That's a lot. And so that's not something that you're going to work off, in the next year or two. Like, you're going to have vulnerabilities in production, even if your AppSec program in development was totally awesome, completely kicking ass. It's still going to take a long time just to work off that backlog. And then there's new vulnerabilities like 0 days coming down the pike and new development and so on. So it's tough. So I think, you need ADR in production to deal with those problems. Like, that's going to give you visibility and protection against most of the major AppSec vulnerability classes. Imagine if you could just protect yourself against SQL injection, file path traversal, XXC, unsafe deserialization, so on. Like, it at least gives you cover while you go back and fix those vulnerabilities. But I also believe I spent my whole career in development side of things. I believe in writing secure code and, having code hygiene around security. And so I don't think it's permission to stop doing those things. I think you really need both. But I do think that the emphasis has been on sort of the left side of the equation,
Mhm.
and that,
Right.
and now the biggest problem is on the right side of the equation because there's a huge gap there that's not really doing anything. And, if the left side of the equation was, well, again, really kicking ass, maybe we wouldn't need as much on the right. But at this point, your best strategy is you got to do some of both. It's like if your house is on fire, like you probably want to engage in fire prevention techniques and buy a fire extinguisher, but at the same time, like, your house is on fire. Like, you got to put out some of those fires right now.
Yeah, you're happy that there's a neighborhood fire department who rushes in and puts out the fire for you.
Right.
Yeah.
Are there any, in terms of, business problems that ADR may solve, or even performance hits or anything like that
Yeah.
that businesses need to consider in incorporating or adding ADR?
Yeah. So, there's a few problems that I think make ADR really urgent. And one is 0 days. Uh, library and library security in general. Like, probably got a ton of libraries with known vulnerabilities in them deployed right now. And uh, even if you do, analysis of those vulnerabilities to see which ones are actually exploitable, like you do runtime reachability or some exploitability testing or whatever, like you still got exposure there, and that's a place where ADR can really provide you some protection. You probably got the same thing for your custom code, a backlog of vulnerabilities that you haven't been able to get to and have fixed. So this is like, to me, that's a a critical use case that you can deploy it against right away and reduce the urgency of that backlog. Maybe it'll allow you to prioritize it a little better and focus on the ones that matter. Because now you've got some air cover. You don't have to be like reacting immediately to every new vulnerability that gets discovered. Um, I do think that the observability use case is really powerful, where you can get a blueprint of every application. Those things are useful for so much beyond security, like just understanding what your workloads do, uh, and being able to see changes in those workloads over time. Oh, wait, we added a new route to that application, or that application just started connecting to our HR database. I didn't know that. Like, those are the observability alerts that ADR can uh, reveal to you. And so it just gives you much more context to have an efficient AppSec program. Now, you asked about performance,
Mhm.
and always a question. If you're going to install something on servers in production, it's going to be a performance question. And the good news here is ADR is really, really fast. It's and I should start that by saying, like, look, if you want to have visibility into who's attacking you and stop those attacks, there's going to be some performance impact, right? Like, it takes a little bit of effort to determine which the real requests are and which the attack requests are. You got to differentiate those. And so there's a little bit of work here. But the good news is that ADR is faster than WAF, probably significantly faster than WAF. It depends a little bit on the app and the environment and so on. But uh, there's a good reason for it. A WAF has to do a whole extra hop, right? Like, it's got to go all the way up the stack, analyze the full HTTP request and response, and send it all the way down the stack into the application. That's expensive. It's probably a few milliseconds on a round trip request. ADR runs inside the running application, so it doesn't have to reparse the application. There's no extra hop. The checks are done inside the functions where the vulnerability exists. So, like, for SQL injection, for example, the security checks are done inside the method that sends the SQL query to the database. It's like right in the exact right place to see the data the way the app sees it. There's none of this, like, decoding and, is it bypassable with URL encoding or base64 encoding or whatever. It sees the data the way the app sees it and analyzes it right there. So it's much more efficient from analysis.
Jeff, where do you see ADR going into the future? So if we were to look in our crystal ball and look 5 years into the future, what do you think? What do you think is going to be different about it? Is the focus going to have changed in some way? Like, what are your thoughts on where this is going?
Yeah, that's a fair question. So how long have you been in AppSec?
About 100 years or so,
Yeah,
something like that. No,
right. Me too. Have you seen a lot of stuff change?
actually, no.
That's what I'm saying. So, like, I honestly, like, I think ADR is the right way to solve this problem, and that it will become part of the standard platform for deploying application workload. We'll have ADR just like it has EDR and other DR kinds of technologies as part of the CDR as part of the normal stack. ADR will be there. It's just, it's like the DR for that layer of the technology stack. And so it'll just, you said firmament before. I think that ADR will become part of that. And that every workload will have that kind of detection and response built into it.
Yeah, it's fair. And yes,
You know,
we have been around a long time. All
I
of us
use this
have.
analogy a lot. Like industrial factories instrument everything. They instrument all their machinery for vibration, sound, temperature, smoke, like everything. And they instrument that stuff because that's how they can see a problem before it becomes a massive business issue. In fact, I study this stuff because I'm kind of interested. But like they can detect problems just because like there's a new vibration in the factory. They're like, oh, there's a bearing out or something. Like they can detect these problems really early. And everything that matters in everything that's complicated, we instrument it. Cars, airplanes, space shuttle, we instrument stuff because that's the only way to see what's going on inside there and detect problems. Well, it's the same thing with software. Software is probably the most complicated thing that man has ever created. And we don't instrument it for security. You have no visibility in what's going on inside there, and it's crazy. So, like, I believe that that is coming to software, is that if you're going to run with security instrumentation because it's the only way to handle the complexity of modern systems, which is exploding. You can't just do it like we used to do it in the old days with a WAF and a web proxy. You have to get inside the running application and see it as it's running.
And don't forget a person that knew how to create regexes.
That's
Yep.
That's right. There's still a few of us around, I think, but I don't want to do it. Regexes make my brain hurt.
They make everybody's brain hurt. So Jeff, since you've already answered the first set of lightning round questions, we had to create a new set just for this interview. But
Yeah.
I'm stealing Robert's thunder. So Robert, please take us to the second edition of
The
the
second
lightning round.
edition. All right. Yeah. So first question is shift left, legitimate concept or joke?
That's a weird way to ask that question. It's, you know what? It's a legitimate concept that didn't really work. So in theory, it sounds great, right? We're going to shift testing early on in the process so that we can prevent these vulnerabilities from ever happening and save all the downstream costs of that. But what happened is the people that were thinking that didn't realize that when you shift left, like into a code repo, and you shift like too far left, you lose all the context of the application. And so then you start generating more and more false positives, which eviscerates the benefit of shifting left in the first place. Because once you have, all these findings, you have to verify them to see whether they're false positive or not. And you burn up all your AppSec resources. And that's exactly what leads to these huge backlogs. So I encourage organizations to look at their vulnerability discovery data, look at the rate of how fast you're discovering vulnerabilities, and look at the rate that you're fixing them. And if those things are diverging, guess what? You're going to build up a massive backlog. And you got to change the curve, to steal the COVID language. Like you got to bend the curve to fix that problem. You got to, I believe you've got to move the testing slightly to the right, not all the way to production, but move the testing to where you can get more context and be more accurate. Like while the application is going through the pipeline, running automated tests, that's a great place because the whole application is assembled. It's all put together and you can actually test it. And the results that you get there are real because you observe them. And that's sort of the essence of the IAST argument is we're going to watch it as you run your normal QA tests and we'll discover security vulnerabilities quietly in the background without any extra work. So I've talked about shifting smart because actually there are some vulnerabilities that you can shift all the way left because they don't require much context, like hard-coded credentials and maybe clickjack and stuff like that is like easy. So shift it. But other stuff that requires a lot of context, like anything with data flow, all the injections, things that require backend connections and so on, you should see those in the code as these. So Shift Smart is my way of communicating that. Now, I do think that actually testing in production is interesting because, and it's something that comes from the quality testing world, because QA environments are never really accurate, right? They have simulated systems, stubs, mocks, a bunch of stuff. They're not real. They're not connecting to your real production users or your real production data. And so it's not real. And so your test results are biased by that. So like actually doing some security testing in production is the only way to know that you've got some issues. And in fact, a lot of people discovered that their use of Log4j in development was not the same as their use of Log4j in production. And so they went and cleaned it all up in development. And then we came in and looked at their systems in production. We're like, hey, you've still got Log4j. And they're like, no way, absolutely not. And of course they do, because we observe it. Like when we report something, it's because we saw it running there. So, I don't really think about shifting right or left as much anymore. I think you should shift to where it's most effective. And that should drive it more than whether it's left or right. Doesn't really matter to me. It's like, where is it cheapest and most accurate to do that test? That's what you do.
Okay. Second question is a conference talk, or is there a conference talk that you recommend folks find on YouTube?
Oh, great question. There's one AppSec talk that I think stands out from any that I've seen. It's a talk by David Rice in the early 2010s, maybe. I don't know. It's been a while, but this talk stands the test of time. He talks about the whole industry and the evolution of security. He goes through a fantastic analogy comparing AppSec to pollution, and talks about how in the environmental industry, the first set of regulations were around end of pipe, meaning like where sewage gets dumped into rivers. And then there was like the green movement. And then he talks about like the blue movement, which is like, if you think of green movement as like sort of bottom line, improve environment because it improves the bottom line. Like he talked about a blue movement in pollution, where the idea is top of line increase because you're doing a good job at environmental protection. And he makes the analogy to AppSec the whole way through, and you realize like, holy shit, we're barely on our way to end of pipe regulation. There's, like green movement would be like maybe this secure by design stuff. And like nobody's really thinking about sort of the blue level of this. So if you want to get a roadmap for like where AppSec could go over the next 30 years, like I think he's painted the roadmap there. That's a great one. If you just want a technical one, look for Orange to Size talk on URL URL-based attacks and how to manipulate URLs. It's the guy's name is Orange, last name TSAI. Mm-hmm. It's a brilliant talk. It's really, really good. I saw it live at DEF CON one year, a few years ago.
Cool. All right. And our last question is, who is somebody that our listeners should know about in AppSec that they probably haven't heard of before?
I'd like to nominate Naomi Buckwalter for that position. She is an expert in application security, and she spends her time building community. She posts entry-level jobs and encourages companies to offer AppSec positions to entry-level folks, and not to have an entry-level position that requires 10 years of experience and certifications and ability to use all the tools in AppSec. It's silly. And so she's really thinking big picture about the whole ecosystem. And she's a fantastic person. She's got a huge following on LinkedIn. So yeah, connect with Naomi and support her efforts, because she's really doing the good work of building the future.
Very cool. Thanks for sharing that pointer. Definitely look Naomi up. What about a final takeaway, Jeff? on this whole conversation. We went a lot of different directions, from basketball to assurance to
Yeah.
ADR.
Uh, I'll close with this. I think AppSec is in a really interesting time. Uh, Matter of fact, I think it's the most interesting time in AppSec since I've been working in it. There's interesting stuff going on. Like there's the the government influence, like they're pushing S bombs and pushing more transparency into AppSec. I think that's going to change things. Mm. Even OMB pushing attestations and potential liability around application security. I think that's super interesting. Uh, I also think that the complexity of applications and APIs is accelerating dramatically. There's new stuff going on, more ridiculous claims about AI's capabilities happening. So, like, the market is really interesting after being, kind of stagnated with SAST and that other one that you don't say and WAF for a number of years. We're finally seeing some real innovation, and I'm excited about ADR. I think it's a really neat innovation, and so that's if you see me out on the road talking at conferences, that's probably what I'll be talking about.
Very cool. Well, Jeff, thanks for coming back to the show to share your wisdom and insights. And we look forward to your fourth appearance sometime next year.
Awesome. Appreciate it. Thanks, guys.